There's a scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where Jack Nicholson is denied the ability to watch the World Series in this mental hospital that he's in. And so he stands in front of the TV and starts doing a fake, play-by-play of the World Series to just pretend like he's watching, and he gets all the other guys excited, and all these patients start standing around the television and cheering and going crazy. And that scene, I changed my life. I was like, whatever that is, I want to do that. I want to arouse in audiences the kind of emotion that scene did for me. It was just such a big moment cinematically, but also just for me personally, like, wow, that's impact. That's something is happening in me, and I want to do that for others. And so that's when I started to want to become a filmmaker.
If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you've heard me and Josh talk about MWI, which is our digital marketing agency. If you're new around here, this may be a first introduction to MWI. We're a full-service digital marketing agency that specializes in everything from website design and development to search engine optimization and all forms of paid advertising, whether it's paid social advertising or paid search advertising, content marketing, digital PR, social media management. Basically anything a business needs to strengthen and grow their digital footprint is what we do over at MWI. The website is mwi.com. And for any listeners of the Hope Strategy podcast, I'd love to offer a free 20-minute consultation with yours truly to talk about your business, to talk about your goals, to understand, what you need to be doing from a digital marketing strategy and action plan standpoint in order to yield some results and grow your business online. So please reach out at mwi.com/hope strategy. That's mwi.com/hope strategy to sign up, and we will be in touch. Now back to the show. Welcome to another episode of the Hope Strategy podcast. We just had a really amazing conversation with Dallas Jenkins, who is the creator and writer, one of three, it sounds like he's got a writing team, but of The Chosen, which is a TV series. It's kind of funny to call it a TV series because that seems to mean that it's on CBS or ABC or something. It's not even on Netflix or anything, but it's a TV series about the life of Christ. But as Dallas would say, and as you hear in the conversation, it's about a lot more than that. It's about the time that Christ lived and the people around him and the stories that sometimes look, stories told about Christ's life given from a different perspective, through a different lens. And I mean,
you could be an atheist and still enjoy watching this.
You'd love it. Yeah. And so a couple things. One, The Chosen is a 100% crowd-funded series. And they didn't say, well, we need crowdfunding. We need to raise $500,000 to put together a decent production. They said, no, we need $10 million to do this. Let's try to raise it through crowdfunding. They've used incredible marketing skills. He's got an incredible marketing team. And a couple of years ago raised, I think, $12 million total to be able to produce a high quality cinematic experience at the top tier of production, and created season 1 where there's 8 episodes. Season 2 just launched on Easter this year, and episodes 2 and 3 are out now as well, which we talked about. And they're planning on doing 7 seasons. And again, like Josh said, it doesn't matter what your belief is, what your foundation is. This is, if you're just interested even in entrepreneurship, the way that they've approached this show and the way that they've produced it and the way that they've released it and the way that they've marketed it is incredible. It's free. He talked about how they were like, should we just make it free to anybody? And they did. And it didn't make sense, but all of a sudden every market that they were in quadrupled and quintupled in revenue when they made the show free, or when they decided to make the show free. So you can get it. You can download the app, the Chosen app. You can watch it on YouTube. You can go to VidAngel, which is the production. I think it's actually just called Angel now. I don't think they're VidAngel.
Yeah, they're just Angel now. You can go to byu.tv.
Yeah. So it's all over the place. And he has an incredible story of ups and downs, trials and tribulations that led him to where he was. And what was cool to see is how his foundation was kind of broken down, like what he believed was going to be his cause and his mission and what he was going to do. And it was kind of broken down to a point where, as he put it, he had to surrender to the fact that he didn't know exactly what he needed to do. He understood why he needed to do things. And you'll hear all about that experience. And then from that moment, how things, as he's let go of outside, worrying so much about outside validation or outside credibility and the things that he was looking for with numbers and figures and dollar amounts and whatever, as he let that go in his career, he's really seen things change, and he's been a disruptor in a lot of things, and has been incredibly successful, and it's changed lives, man. Not many people you talk to have created the type of content that he's created that really, truly people love and are impacted by, and has really changed lives. So Josh and I are big fans. So it was a real kind of a fanboy experience to talk to him and hear the behind the scenes a little bit, but also, we had a really good human to human interaction and conversation about how he got to where he is and what he's working on. And it was fascinating.
As we've seen Christianity and religion at large come under greater and greater attack, and you see that the number of people attending church regularly is diminishing every year by like 5 to 10% per year. Like, it's crazy the rate at which people identify as religious in the United States, at least. And we see this happening, and we see, like, it used to be more like, well, people don't like religious people, or they're making fun of religious people. Hollywood's being mean to us type of thing. But just in the past, like 1 to 2 or 3 years, it's like religion's really under attack, not just by people like culturally, but by the government. Like, it's actually like, we're really seeing things happen where you're like, this could get really scary in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
And you've seen leaders in our church, but you've seen leaders in other churches as well saying, we Christians need to stick together. That whole thing of we all hang together or we all hang separately. Like, we're being pushed to hanging together. And I look at this and how this breaks down those walls between Christians of different denominations. And I think this is important. Like, there's something going on here that's bigger than just, hey, let's inspire a bunch of people and let's bring people to Christ. But it's more than just, let's make a movie that brings people to Christ. It's like our survival, our ability to worship as we choose to, might depend on us hanging together and uniting with other Christians. And this movie does that in a way that I've never seen anything else do that.
Yeah.
And I feel like, yes, of course, God's hand is in this, but it might be in this in ways that we can't really perceive or see right now. It might be more than just a missionary tool. It might be something that we're going to rely on and say, wow, if it weren't for the chosen, like, where would we be today? Like, we might not be able to worship freely, but because of that, we've banded together. Anyway, you know where I'm going with that.
And I think we got this across to him, and then hearing him bear testimony of experiences he's had is it just reaffirms it. But he's playing this like really pivotal role that it seems like he's aware of, but probably, like you said, not even close to what he could read really, or we could even fathom. Because again, never has there been something that I watch it, he watches it, Catholic watches it, a Muslim person watches it who believes in him historically, and then you all come together and say, wow, that's really well done. And I felt something during it. That's just not, and honestly, like you said, if we were to show, it's kind of like, and again, no disrespect. I think the church is probably learning something from this, but a lot of the church's videos that portray Christ and stuff, a lot of them, it's like, okay, let's watch this with the kids. But then at the end, we really need to like really talk about it a lot, because we got to like help them understand why we care about that, because it's hard to portray that emotion. But I love that we brought together that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest experience, because that's what he has become so good at. And that's so important. That's in the mission, whether it's missionary work or just like anything that's going to promote change in you, you have to feel that emotion. And it doesn't matter who you are, where you're coming from. That's what you're feeling when you're watching that. And it promotes, I can't think of anything negative that promotes those feelings that he's producing through this content.
Yeah, it's interesting because that became his measuring point, his benchmark to say, I want to produce this thing. And everything that he's ever done since then, he's been measuring himself against that to say, am I producing something that hits that benchmark? Yes or no? If no, I've got something to learn. Or if it's not hitting that for other people, then I've got something to learn. I need to make progress because I've got this benchmark in my mind. And how valuable is that to have something like that you can constantly refer back to and just say, am I measuring up? Am I hitting that or not? And it's funny because we get criticized, right? Religious people get criticized generally as, oh, you're tied down. You have all these restrictions, these standards, all this stuff. It's like, yeah, for him, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that moment, that was his standard. Because of that standard, he's been able to have the largest crowdfunding media project in the history of crowdfunding, doing this miraculous thing because he has a standard. The standard's not a restriction. It's something that liberated him, that's helping him to do what he really wants to do. And it's sad that people look at standards and commandments and religion and they only see restrictions, when in reality, what God is trying to do is say, hey, I'm giving you a standard so that you can rise to that level and enjoy the blessings that come with being at that level. Like, why would you not want this? Why would you not want to be a better filmmaker? Why would you not want to be the best that you can be? I'm just trying to help you get there. And you're telling me that, no, I don't want that because it's restrictive. It's like, it's not restrictive at all.
Yeah. And there's no way he could have known in that moment as a 16-year-old watching that movie, the impact that would have. Stay around to the very end, because at the very end, Josh brought in his daughter just to meet Dallas as a fan, and that was probably that was incredible. That moment and the personal tie to. I'm not even going to talk about it, but
I actually wasn't expecting all the other stuff to come out of that. I thought, oh, I'm just going to tell him thanks and introduce my daughter, and then we'll cut this off. It won't even be in the podcast. But then it sparked some more thoughts from Dallas, and I think we all got emotional there, and he certainly was. I was, and he told us some things that were really unique and interesting about the show and about other things that, So listen to the end.
Go all the way through. It's a good conversation. Please enjoy this episode of the Hope Strategy Podcast with Dallas Jenkins.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley.
I was just talking to Josh. Obviously, we did our personal prep, and then we were talking about it together for a few minutes, but it's funny. So I went on and found your email address on this tool, like kind of was like using a new tool to find guests for the show. We've had incredible people on, but I was like there, and you were literally the first name that popped into my head. I was like, both Josh and I are big Chosen fans. And so I was so, pumped when you responded and just taking the time to talk to us, and we appreciate it. I know we came out of nowhere, and so thanks for taking some time with us.
No, it's cool. I like podcasts. I love the format of them, to talk a little bit more other than sound bites. And so it looks like you guys are doing a really cool thing.
You are no stranger to selfie video podcast talking about, geez Louise, the amount of content you've put out in the last couple of years, not just unbelievable cinematic TV series content, but you personally, that's a lot of work. Walking around the set, doing daily updates, giving updates on the GoFundMe stuff. The last 3 or 4 years you have been busy.
Stupid. My partner, Daryl Eves, who's one of the top experts in social media, audience building and brand building. He pushed me into it and said, people need to know you. And that's going to be what takes the brand to the next level. Kicking and screaming. I don't mind talking. I'm a talker. So that's not the problem. It's just, it means that I have 2 jobs now. So
yeah, totally. Josh, what was that book you just held up? That's Daryl Eves' book, but what's the book called?
Daryl Eves, the YouTube formula. I've got it on my desk right here.
Nice.
Yeah.
My camera is disconnected from my laptop, so I didn't see you when you held it up. But he's my partner in this project from day one. So that's why we have such a heavy social media presence. But it's worked, for better or worse.
Well, our day job, Josh and I's day job, well, of a couple of them, but we run a digital marketing agency. So we're very hyper aware of all things marketing and digital and social. And I mean, as a follower of both Josh and I, Josh was joking earlier how he was watching the first season of The Chosen and he saw his dad's name scroll across the credits because Josh's dad too, has been a part of, anyways, we've all been engaged since the very beginning.
The funny thing is,
was your dad one of the investors? You mean like he?
Yeah, he was in the credits at the end of season 1.
Oh, cool.
But the funny thing was, I reached out to him around like season 7. I'm like, "Hey, Dad, have you watched this yet?" He's like, "No, I've never heard of it." He's like 85. He's like, "I've never heard of it." And then we're watching the credits and we see his name go down, and we're like, "Wait a second!" Like,
so he was joking when he said he'd never heard of it, or he's.
No, he just forgot.
He donated. He probably saw something on Facebook a year or two before and gave some money. Yeah.
Oh, funny. Yeah. Well,
he not only forgot about The Chosen, he forgot that he sent you money.
And he's gonna get money eventually because the show is doing quite well. I mean, like the long-term prospects of the show for those who invested originally, like your dad, are significant. So he'll probably end up getting a check someday and be like, "Oh, nice.
Oh, great. The Chosen." So give us the background of you as an individual. Obviously, there's the projects that you've been working on, all of the blood, sweat, and tears you've been putting in over the years. It's coming from a place of true passion and ambition, but a lot of what you're doing based on the story you're telling, the life of Christ, has a lot of personal conviction involved as well. So I'd love to hear your background growing up, both kind of your relationship with maybe religion and Christ and that process that you went through, and how that led to where you are today, but also as a director, as a cinematographer, somebody who's creating content and the creative that you've done.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I grew up in a very strict evangelical conservative Baptist type home where my parents, and I'm grateful for this, so this isn't a complaint, but my parents were very restrictive when it came to media. Even though my dad, as I found out when I got older, was a huge movie buff, and he consumed a lot of media, but they were pretty protective of us as kids growing up. And of course, in that environment, in the churches that I grew up in, very strict conservative environment, and the relationship between the church and media and Hollywood was very strained. The only time you ever really heard about a church Hollywood connection was in the form of a boycott. And there was very few examples of Christian media. Usually they were done by missions groups or, like Billy Graham organization would do a movie every few years, and we called them church basement videos, where the youth group would maybe get together and watch a documentary or watch some sort of, it was always this small little movie, usually based on a true story. And the Christian entertainment landscape was minuscule, and the Hollywood landscape, of course, was huge. And Christians, at least in my environment, my portion of the Christian community, was very negative towards Hollywood. So I was a sports freak. So when I was growing up, I went to Bible school, I went to church. So I was a Bible guy. I was a Bible nerd. I was memorizing scripture from the time I was young, but I was also like reading the sports page of every single day from the time I was 5 years old. The Chicago Tribune sports page. I've probably missed, a few days a year over the last 40 years or so.
So are we White Sox, Cubs, Bulls, Bears? What's the?
Yes. all of the above. So, and I was also an athlete, and, so I was essentially a jock all the way through, into college too, but it was, when I got into junior high, my dad sat me down and basically said, "All right, I'm a big movie buff. I love movies. You and I haven't watched stuff together because, we're pretty protective, but now it's time for you to start getting introduced to the classics, So middle school is when I started seeing movies like The Godfather and Bonnie and Clyde and all these classics. And it was when I saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, my freshman year of high school, it was on TV, that everything changed for me. I went from, it was like I was watching, there's a scene in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where Jack Nicholson is denied the ability to watch the World Series in this mental hospital that he's in. And so he stands in front of the TV and starts doing a fake, play by play of the World Series to just pretend like he's watching, and he gets all the other guys excited, and all these patients start standing around the television and cheering and going crazy. And that scene, I changed my life. I was like, whatever that is, I want to do that.
Just the emotion and the way that he was able to portray it. You said, I want to be able to do that, figure out how to get that out.
I want to arouse in audiences the kind of emotion that scene did for me. It was just such a big moment cinematically, but also just for me personally, like, wow, that's impact. That's something is happening in me, and I want to do that for others. And so that's when I started to want to become a filmmaker. Now, my dad is also an author. My dad's one of the most successful authors of all time. He wrote the Left Behind books, which sold 70 million copies. And that happened when I was in college, and that started to grow. So I always had a storytelling gene in me, but I my dad wasn't a filmmaker, obviously. So, but that's where the whole storytelling thing came from. That's where the desire to make movies ultimately came from. And when the Left Behind movie started to get developed by a small company out of Louisville, I went and I graduated from college and went to work for them and started as a low-level secretary. I mean, I was just bottom of the totem pole, and writing letters and emails and dropping off FedEx packages at 10 o'clock at night before the plane left, and all that. And as I grew in that company, right when they started to get ready to make the actual movie, that's when I left, because we knew, we could tell that the movie wasn't going to be what we had hoped it was going to be. It was going to be similar to kind of the Christian movies that I had grown up with. So my dad and I started our own thing. We called it Jenkins Entertainment. And one of the things we noticed when we were starting to, I moved to Los Angeles, we started meeting with people, and we noticed that there were a lot of people in the independent space outside the studio system. The studio system is like 20th Century Fox and Disney and Warner Brothers, big budget movies. And then there's the independent side. People get financing from private equity. And that's where we were coming from. I was 25 years old. I had no standing in the industry. So we noticed that there were a lot of people talking about making movies and were close to making movies, but very few were actually making them. So we just thought the thing that's going to set us apart is if we just go ahead and make a movie. And so I was 25 years old. I'd never actually been on a movie set before, but my dad had the means, because of the Left Behind books had blown up. And so we had the means, just go ahead and made a movie. And we made a movie called Hometown Legend. And it was a high school faith-based football film set in Alabama. This was before faith-based football films were cool. Now there's been like 15 of them. Yeah. But we just had
Leanne Tui on the show a couple weeks ago from The Blind Side, the mom from The Blind Side.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Yeah, she is.
And that movie did a little better than Hometown Legend did.
Just a little bit.
But this was, again, the Christian movie industry was tiny. I mean, there was just a few of us who were trying to do this, and there wasn't really a means to reach the ultimate audience like it's been reached now. So we were really figuring things out on our own.
It's really interesting, that whole dynamic, because you would think, Christianity, especially in the United States, has always had a huge audience. Like if you're just looking at demographics, a huge chunk historically, maybe less now than ever, but a huge chunk, especially, when you were growing up, it's interesting that dot was never connected successfully before. That was, no, look at just from a marketing and audience standpoint, there is a big audience here for this.
Econ 101, the demand is there. Where's the supply?
Yeah,
exactly. So the supply was small. But that you just said something really interesting. The demand was there. I don't think people knew that they wanted it. At least in my world. Now there's multiple segments of the Christian community.
For sure.
In fact, when you do studies that say like half the country is Christian, I think that tends to just mean not Jewish. I think it just means like, it's just a term that describes like people who claim to believe in God, people who
That's
aren't,
fair.
Because I think a more accurate definition is how many people go to church on a regular basis. There's also the Catholic community. Within the Christian circle, there's people like myself, families like myself, who were like devoted, go to church 3 times a week, super conservative, fundamentalist, even in nature. Then there's kind of the middle ground where the people go to church, but it's not, they're not like activists about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's just people who would say, yeah, I'm Christian, just because that just describes the fact that they, they believe in God, but they're not that passionate about it. So, that's why when certain movies come out, like God's Not Dead, they'll make like $60, $70 million at the box office. But when you think about it, that represents probably 6, 7, 8 million people, which isn't a huge number, relatively speaking. And so there's a large chunk of the faith-based crowd that doesn't even watch God's Not Dead because they're not in that segment of activism, and they watch regular movies like everybody else. Now, that is what would explain the success of The Blind Side, because when you take a movie like The Blind Side and have Sandra Bullock in it, and it's a mainstream movie, that probably would have made $100 million or so just because it was a good movie. But when you add then that larger Christian community that's extra passionate because it happens to be faith-based, then that's when you start to go into the $200 million, $250 million category. But that's different from a movie like God's Not Dead.
True. God's Not Dead, and I can only imagine some of those movies do have a ceiling, and the ceiling seems to be around $70, $80 million because they haven't quite pushed through that wall into the full mainstream, which includes even mainstream Christians who aren't activists. So that may be a bit of a rabbit trail, but that goes back to your point about supply and demand. And back in 2000, which is when Hometown Legend came out, no one had figured out how to even reach that core Christian community, the Christian, because a lot of that core Christian community doesn't even like to go to movie theaters. They probably see 1 or 2 movies a year, and they tend to be super strong Christian movies. But even the music industry hadn't really broken out. The Christian music industry was ahead of the Christian film industry. So I was in the middle of all that, and I was trying to be more mainstream. I didn't necessarily want to make church basement movies. But the cool thing is Hometown Legend, even though it's not a perfect movie and it was small and independent, it got picked up by Warner Brothers, which 90% of independent movies never get picked up by a studio, especially back then. And this is you, 25, never been on a movie set, direct a movie, and it gets picked up by Warner Brothers. That's a big win right out the gate.
Which was it was a huge win. And the movie didn't end up making money. It didn't make a profit. It's really hard to make a profit in movies. But we got a taste of it. Of course, we learned how to make movies really well. I don't know if it was really well, but we learned how to make movies decently. And the movie ended up being in all over the world. And I remember I had a call from a friend once who said, I'm in a hotel in China and I'm watching your movie right now. And I mean, that's a huge thing. And that was really, really cool. And we learned a ton, and, we got in a few movie theaters. I mean, it was a big deal. And, but that was the beginning of it for us, is doing these movies outside the system, or at least financing outside the system, but then getting picked up by the system. And my next feature film was a film called Midnight Clear, got picked up by Lionsgate and got a national release and an international release. And so all of the first few movies that I made ended up getting picked up by studios and distributed worldwide in some form. And then we did a Hallmark Channel movie, which based on one of my dad's books, and that did well. And so we had in the 10 years that I lived in LA, in Hollywood, from 2000 to 2010, we weren't doing huge business and we weren't making tons of money, but we were building something success. It was working. Yeah. I mean, it was working. We were doing enough to keep going. Go ahead.
Humility aside, what was the difference between you and the other 90% that never get picked up? Because I mean, this is pretty amazing for you to come in, new filmmaker, not really experienced, and then get 3 movies picked up by big studios. Like, why doesn't that happen to the other 90%?
Well, I do think that you have to find some sort of niche. There has to be some sort of easily definable audience that the movie's going to connect to. And most independent movies are more artsy. They tend to be smaller stories. They're not going to be big stories that are going to appeal to the masses. And that was true of my movie as well. My movies, I didn't have huge stars in them. They weren't big budget, but the studios around that time, because of The Passion of the Christ and because of Left Behind, they were trying to reach that Christian audience. They were starting to figure it out. When Warner Brothers picked it up, Warner Brothers didn't pick it up for their big theatrical release, strategies. They were doing it. They was going to go straight to video. So it was just a nice family film and they liked it. But when we started talking about the faith elements, And they were like, wow, there's a whole world out there of people that gather every weekend in one room to hear a message for an hour and a half. Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is gather people into one room every weekend for an hour and a half. So they really wanted to connect with that audience like The Passion of the Christ did and like Left Behind was. And so when they realized that there was a demand, which is what The Passion of the Christ opened up and Left Behind opened up, then they were like, all right, well, let's get a supply. Who's there? I happened to be there. There were very few of us, but I was one of them. And my movies never hit The Passion of the Christ level, of course. But I happened to be in the right place at the right time for that. And we were able to have some moderate levels of success by doing these small movies and faith-based movies. And when you look back on those movies now, I'm still proud of them and they were decent films, but I wasn't a good filmmaker back then. I mean, I really wasn't. I realized after my second movie, I sent it to my mentor. I think this is true for everybody in any business, is really to surround yourself with people who are way better than you are. And here's the secret code. When I sent him one of my movies to get advice before it had released, he said to me, you really are an amateur. And he was pointing out all these things that just were really amateurish. But here's the difference. I listened. I believed him. I believed him. And I said, okay, how do I become a pro? And to his credit, he was willing. I mean, I sent him email every day asking different questions, and he would send me movies to watch and things to read, and I just devoured it. I became so passionate about being a good filmmaker. And I spent a year pretty much just doing nothing but that, just like voraciously pursuing betterment.
So all the different entrepreneurs we've talked to, or academics that have reached the highest level of academia, or religious leaders that have reached, one of the things that continues to come up is that exact process. One, where you're able to put your ego to the side and you're able to say, tell me something that I need, how can I be better? But really even more than that, it's the next step in that process, which comes from a place that we've talked to all these people. We're trying to figure out where that comes from, because some people in that moment just say, well, I guess I'm not good at that. I'm going to move on to the next thing. Other people say, no matter what the cost, I will dedicate every second of every day to fix this, to be better, to make this happen. Guy Kawasaki said it. He said, and again, he didn't invent this in any way, shape, or form, but he said of working with Steve Jobs and working with these tech entrepreneurs, and he said it's just grit. It's simply put as like, you either have it or you don't, and some people do, and some people don't. And I mean, where for you specifically, what were those moments like when you're hit with you're confronted with the fact, hey, you're decent at this. Hey, you've seen some success, but you've got a long way to go. What is that like thing that's motivating you to say, for the next year, I'm heads down, I'm making this thing happen, I'm figuring this out, and I'm going to be better at my craft?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a third option too, in terms of how people respond, which is, no, I'm not an amateur. I'm actually good. You don't get it.
Pride. Yeah.
And I'm going to keep staying the course, because they mix up the two. They mix up the whole grit. I'm going to do it no matter what. I'm going to plow through. And I'm not going to take no for an answer.
There's a lot of very fine lines between these three things. And it goes for anything, just to like make it relatable to not just making movies. A good example is when Josh and I started working together. Josh is a mentor to me in a lot of ways. And as we started working together, I remember sending him like an email early on that was like, hey, this is an email I'm sending to a client, or a proposal, and him tearing it apart, and me getting literally an email back that was all red and all crossed out. And I remember that moment of having to be like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I need to be able to accept that and get better. But anyway, so to go back into what you were saying with the option.
No,
three.
it's a key point. I mean, I think, if you want to go back far, I think, and this is true of society in general, I think fatherhood has a lot to do with it. I think that one of the biggest problems in society is a lack of fathers. I think that, or a lack of strong fathers. I had a father who continually, when I was growing up, was pushing me to get better, pushing me to listen. When I got my first job, I think everyone's instinct the first time they get rebuked by their boss is to like go, what the heck? And what, he just hates me for no reason. And what, and to be kind of self-motivated. And my dad was always like proverbial, not literally, but proverbially smacking me in the head going, we'll find out how to get better, He told me once, I'll never forget this. My first job was at Blockbuster Video. Before that, I'd worked like when I was young, like in 6th grade. I remember I would go every summer, spend 3 weeks at my cousin's house, detasseling corn in the cornfields of Illinois. I think anyone who's learned how to work on a farm, that's gonna take care of any grit issues you have. But my dad's, it was time for me to get a raise or a promotion, and I was gonna have this conversation with the district manager of Blockbuster, and when you're 16 years old and they're going to, they're negotiating is not really something that typically happens, but I was being promoted to be a manager. And at 16, because when I first got the job, my dad said to me, if all you do is just your job, you're going to actually be ahead of most people that you're working with. Most people, the majority of people don't even do their jobs. They do the bare minimum, He goes, if you do your job, you're going to be ahead. If you do more than your job, if you look for opportunities to succeed, if you're doing extra, you're going to sail through. You're going to get promoted fast. People are desperate for good workers. So I did. Within a couple months of working at Blockbuster, I got promoted to a full-time, 45-hour-a-week management. Like I was one of the branch managers and I was 16. And when I went in for the conversation about that, my dad said to me, just say to them, what do I need to do to be worth, at the time, it's so funny to think back on it, $6.85 an hour was what I was asking for. And I think minimum wage was in the 5s. And I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I don't believe in minimum wage anyway, but I remember being promoted to management, I was going to get a raise. Yeah. And so the minimum wage wasn't the factor, but I think they were probably going to offer me something like $6. So I said, well, what do I need to do to be worth $6.85? And they had never been asked that question before. They ended up offering me, I think, $6.25 or something like that, which I took, but it was more than they were going to offer me. And that mindset of my father telling me, don't go in and say, I'm worth this. Go in and say, what do I need to do to be worth that? And that's just a mentality that I think is important. And I think when you have that mentality, and you can learn it, you can work on it. I think it's a defeatist mentality to say, you're born with it or you're not. Because in fact, I'm sure I've read a lot of the same books that Guy Kawasaki has read. Is it Kawasaki or Kowalski?
Kawasaki.
That's what I thought.
Like the motorcycle.
Make sure. Yeah, big difference actually in the ethnicities.
Yeah,
Kawasaki and
Russian or
Kowalski is like Chicago. It's like Polish Chicago. So because I have one of his books actually, but there's books on mindset. Carol Dweck is a famous author who wrote this book called Mindset about the growth mindset versus the I'm blanking on the other one, but the growth mindset is where you really you don't accept your own personality as stagnant. You go, okay, how can I learn? And you can develop grit just by shifting. I think she didn't say this, but I kind of made this up, and I don't know if it's good or not, but by shifting your sentences to end with question marks instead of periods, and so I think that mentality of what can I do to be worth this, or what can I do to learn? My question to my mentor, Scott Derrickson, when he said you're an amateur, I was like, okay, so instead of saying, well, no, I'm a pro, or, well, I want to be a pro, or no, I suppose I am an amateur. I was like, okay, how can I be a pro? Having a curious mind. That's a book by Brian Grazer, one of the top producers in Hollywood history, is all about curiosity, curiosity about yourself, curious about others, curious about how to get better. So I think my dad started me with that, but I think I've really worked hard to develop this, never being content to stay put. I just want to
and ridding yourself of any sense of ententitlement, right?
If you have that, if you feel like you're entitled to anything, that's going to be a killer for you in any walk of life.
Yeah. So to jump forward a little bit, so you had your 10-year run in LA, and I watched as I was doing some research here, I want you to share the story and I think it's the next step in this journey, which was that moment where you said, okay, I've seen a level of success. I've honed my craft. I've become better and better. But then you had some pretty big punches to the gut that had you down, and I'm not sure if it was immediately after that or a little ways down the road, but I love this story, and I'm not even going to question you through it as much as I just want to hear you tell it for the audience. But this story of the moments of defeat that you faced,
Yeah.
And then so I love that aspect of it, obviously, overcoming difficult circumstances, overcoming these problems that you face. I also love the aspect of it, of the relationship with your spouse and how you two had to come together as a team and work through this. And then you bring in, this isn't a religious podcast. I always say that it seems like we've had a lot of religious people on and stuff, but I love understanding your spiritual processes and and the loaves and fishes story and this whole idea, because it's such a beautiful story of not only overcoming some significant trial and objection and difficulty, but really finding in the dark moments those those lights, I guess, or the hope that was going to allow you, even when you were seeing success, to continue to remember that moment, to stay hungry and to stay motivated and to stay driven for your goal. So walk us through the next steps in the journey pre-chosen.
Yeah. And I think the spiritual aspect of it, the for me in my faith, I think all the things that we've been talking about in terms of grit and effort and problem solving are all absolutely true. But there is this piece for me, and I think for many other Christians too, where you reach a point of surrender, where you ultimately realize you can't accomplish everything yourself. So for me, in 2010, I was asked, my whole family and I moved back to Chicago, where I grew up, and to work at a church, which seems to not make a whole lot of sense, but there's a mega church, 13,000 members, of annual operating budget of over $20 million. And they wanted to make movies. They wanted me to come and make movies within this structure, but movies that could be out in theaters, like what I was already doing. So I did that. And it was 2017 was when my movie came out. But the first movie that I had an opportunity to make, first full-length movie, was a movie called The Resurrection of Gavin Stone. And you probably haven't heard of it. And that's the main reason why I have my story, which is I finally got to the point where I had the opportunity to work with Hollywood. My goal all along had been to be affirmed by Hollywood. I know I had a lot of narcissistic tendencies, and affirmation was my love language. I wanted to be affirmed and respected. And so doing these faith-based movies, independently financed, was nice. And they were picked up by Hollywood and they were having some measures of success, which was cool. But ultimately I wanted to win an Academy Award. That was my ultimate goal. And I also wanted to make a movie that was financed by Hollywood, that was produced by Hollywood, that I, could where I could say, like, now I no longer have to crawl on glass just to get a movie made. And that finally happened. I had done a short film that got in the hands of one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, and he loved it, and he wanted to make faith-based movies. He was interested in faith-based movies. A guy by the name of Jason Blum, who Blumhouse Productions is, in terms of pure profit, one of the most successful companies of all time. They make nearly every horror film that you've ever seen out in theaters, like Get Out and Insidious and Sinister and all these great horror films that were done for low budgets, $5 million or less, and then they make hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, he was interested in faith-based movies for a lot of the same reasons he was interested in horror films, because he saw a lot of interesting profit potential. And so anyway, they were willing to finance and produce this movie with me. And the cool thing about them was they loved what I brought to the table, and they're marketing geniuses. So they actually thought, we're not going to try to change you. We're not going to try to tone down the faith-based elements of this. If anything, we want to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, we want to exploit the faith-based elements and go after this new audience that we're learning about. So they find, the movie was financed and when I made the movie, it tested through the roof, higher than any movie they'd ever done. And they started to plan multiple movies with me in the future. We were going to do 5 movies over the next 10 years. I had arrived. I had gotten my goals. I had achieved a lot of what I had set out to do. And then the movie came out in theaters, and I'll never forget this day, because it was inauguration day in 2017, January 20th. And you get the numbers in around noon, as soon as the theaters open in New York and you start getting the ticket sales, you can pretty much plot out exactly how the weekend's going to go, to extreme accuracy.
Yeah.
And within 2 hours, we knew this movie was a total flop. It was lower than their lowest projections. And it became very clear that these companies that I was working with were not going to do, we're not going to do all of the movies that we were planning on in the future. I went in 2 hours from being a director with a very bright future to a director with no future. And I was just totally shocked and rattled by it. I was home alone with my wife, and we were crying and praying and trying to figure out all that was going on. And the thing that I was so confused about was how this movie, in terms of my relationship with God, believing that God had actually called me to this, and I had gotten everything that I had achieved, and there had been so many moments that had felt like God moments to lead it to this point, and now it just completely failed. And we were like, wow, I guess God wasn't in this process. I guess I must have missed the boat. And my wife, when she was praying, she had very strongly on her heart, like God pressed it almost as clearly as if he said it out loud. Two things. One was the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Like, go read the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospels. And then also this phrase, I do impossible math. Now, for those of you who aren't believers, this might seem very strange, and we don't hear God's voice audibly, but we sometimes believe that there are times when you feel like God is just laying something very explicit on your heart.
An impression of sorts.
This phrase, I do impossible math. And so we went and read the story of the feeding of the 5,000. There's a famous story in the Gospels of 5,000 people are all hungry because they're listening to Jesus, and he's been talking for several days. And the disciples come to him and say, everyone's starving, we need to send them home. And Jesus says, no, we can't send them home because they'll faint if we send them home. That's how tired and hungry they are. So let's go find some food. So they find 5 loaves and 2 fish, and from this boy, and they bring him to Jesus, and they're like, that's all we can find. I guess we need to go find more. And he's like, no, I got this, And so he miraculously multiplies the 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeds 5,000 people. And so we read that story, and one of the things that stood out to us was that Jesus wasn't surprised by it. He was actually responsible for, in many ways, the hunger that led to the miracle. It was his fault, if you want to look at it that way, that everyone was so tired and hungry, and the only thing left was a miracle. So we thought, along with the phrase, I do impossible math, this story must be about God's trying to tell us that something's coming. He's gotten us to this place where the only thing left is a miracle. So that must be what's coming next. It's a miracle. And so we thought the box office numbers would magically turn around, and we would have this really cool story. Well, that didn't happen. And that night, the numbers didn't improve at all. They stuck to the possible math, not the impossible math. So we were really unsure, like, well, what does this mean? Certainly God was leading us to this, but we had no idea what it meant. And that night at 4:00 in the morning, I was up doing what I'm guessing you have done, and whoever's listening has done, especially if you're an entrepreneur, and if you're a good one. You do what we call a post-mortem. You analyze everything that went wrong and everything that went right. In this case, very few things went right. And if you're a good entrepreneur, you're self-analyzing. You're not entitled to anything. It's like, what did I do wrong? And I had a 15-page memo that I was writing of all the things that I had done wrong and all the things that the rest of our partners had done wrong. And up on my screen, a Facebook notification popped up from someone that I barely know. I've never actually met them. And they didn't say hi. They didn't say hello. We'd talked a few times over the last few years. They didn't even say, I heard about your movie. The message just said, remember, your job is not to feed the 5,000. Your job is only to provide the loaves and fish. And I honestly thought for a moment that my computer had been recording what my wife and I had been talking. I was like, what in the world? Who did we tell about our conversations today and what God had been sharing with us? And so I typed back right away and I said, what are you doing up at 4 a.m? And he said, well, I'm in Romania. I'm on a different time zone. I'm here visiting my brother. And I said, why did you tell me that? Before I respond, just tell me why you said that to me. And he says, oh, that wasn't me. God just wanted me to share that with you. And I'll never forget that moment, obviously, as long as I live. It changed me forever, because I knew in that moment that God, again, was present, that he saw me. And I've ended up talking to that guy. His name is Alex. Actually, I had him on a live stream a couple of weeks ago talking about that moment. It was the first time I actually met Alex. We didn't even meet in person, but we were doing a Zoom call. First time I talked to him audibly. And he said he was walking. He had been looking forward to this movie because he had seen an advanced screening, really liked it, thought it was going to be a success. And then he went and looked at the box office numbers and just knew it was a bomb. And he was like, oh, he was so disappointed. And so he was walking back to his house and God just laid it on his heart as clearly as he'd laid it on my wife's heart. Tell Dallas it's not his job to feed the 5,000. It's just to provide the loaves and fish. And he's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. You really want me to say that? And so he did. He just went and told me that. And it changed my life and changed his life in many ways too, because of how he knew to listen to God. But in that moment, I knew that everything I'd been doing up until that point, where I'd been very results focused and I had taken responsibility for my results, and that all went away. And I stopped measuring the success or failure of each initiative that I did or idea that I had or calling that God maybe had given me. I stopped measuring it by numbers and by how many people, that wanted to watch it, or by the rest of the world's standards. And I just started measuring things by the loaves and fish that I provided, at the risk of sounding cheesy. I want to make them as good and healthy as they can be. Now, that doesn't absolve me from my responsibility. It's not like God's like, I'll do everything. We'll just go ahead and create the loaves and fish from nothing and feed 5,000 people. He still used them, the loaves and fish that he provided. When it came time to multiply the fish and loaves, he still had the disciples distribute them. He had them do everything that they didn't need him for. So I'm still obsessed with making sure that my 5 loaves and 2 fish are as good and healthy as they can be. But I was like, if I never make another movie, that's okay. I just want to be wherever God wants me to be. And I'm going to focus on the day-to-day, what I can do. And that is, I don't think that's anything unheard of or unprecedented. I mean, there's lots of cliches about just focus on what you can do and leave the rest up to, the gods, or leave the rest up to nature, whatever it is. But for me, this was very profound spiritually and, physically. So that's why I was open-minded to some really crazy ideas. I really, truly got to that place where I genuinely didn't care about the results. I just was going to focus on doing whatever I could day by day.
Was it that evening or a day or two after that? At what point did you say, maybe making this huge budget Hollywood movie that we had banked on wasn't the thing? Maybe that was just a stepping stone to something else. At what point did that thought enter your mind? Because it's hard to accept that something that big might just be a stepping stone to something better.
Yeah, I think words are very important. And so I'm going to make sure I'm clear about I definitely thought maybe this isn't the thing. I definitely thought, okay, maybe I'm not meant to make movies. I didn't think better or worse. This is going to lead to something better. Those words stopped being parts of my vocabulary, because what does that mean even? I mean, I just thought, okay, The Resurrection of Gavin Stone is not a successful movie. Now, here's what's ironic, just to flash forward for just a second, that movie's now on Netflix and it's having a little bit of a resurgence because of my project, The Chosen. And now tons of people are watching it more than ever and they love it. And so that's kind of a cool thing, but let's not skip ahead. We'll go back to that moment. I genuinely stopped caring about better or worse, more successful, less successful. I really did surrender to, it's not my job to feed the 5,000. Like, the results are not up to me if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And so when it came time to do this short film for my church's Christmas Eve service, where this opportunity came up where they were like, I'd done it for my church before. I'd done other short films and vignettes, but when we said, let's just do this thing for Christmas Eve, a short film about the birth of Christ. That's, I did that on my friend's farm in Illinois, 20 minutes from where I live. That's a really small thing. That's a big step down, technically, from the movie that I'd done with these Hollywood producers. I mean, the budget was, 1/20th of what I'd done before. And the crew was minuscule, and it was for a church. It was for a Christmas Eve service. This was never going to be seen outside of my church. And I was completely great with that. And I wasn't thinking The Resurrection of Gavin Stone's failure led to something better, because, doing a short film for my church isn't better. In fact, by most standards, it's much worse, depending on how you look at it. But for me, I didn't care. I was like, this is a small loaf and a small fish, but I'm okay with that. And shooting that short film is when I was like, man, you know what? Every time I do these short films, every time I'm telling the stories of Christ, but from a different perspective, birth of Christ from the perspective of the shepherds in this case. And I'd done other short films about the crucifixion and the resurrection, but from the eyes of different people, different stories, taking the traditional gospel stories, but just not changing them, but just telling them from different perspectives. It's like, man, I feel like I'm in my wheelhouse. I'm more happy and more fulfilled. And I think I'm better than when I'm doing this than any other thing that I do. Wouldn't it be cool to do like a show, like a multi-season show about the life of Christ, where I can take the time like I am in this short film to like develop all these other characters and see Jesus from a different perspective and maybe unlock these Bible stories for a lot of people for whom they've become routine, or maybe they didn't even know the stories, but when you read the Bible, they're only like 2 or 3 verses long. There's always been movies and miniseries about Christ, but never a multi-season show. And multi-season shows are great because you can binge watch them and you can follow these characters from season to season and really take the time to develop them instead of these cardboard cutouts that you always see in Jesus projects. Well, that'd be really cool. But of course I didn't have the means to do that. But that's where I was like, oh, that'd be a really cool idea. But obviously, I don't know if that'll ever happen, but it's a great idea. And just concentrating on that short film and making it as good as can be was that moment for me of going, Resurrection of Gavin Stone and those big movie producers isn't the thing, but I don't know what the thing is. And when I was asked to speak at a few conferences, just because I'm a filmmaker and I would speak at film conferences or whatever, I shared the story that I just shared with you now. And at the time, I was in that position that I'm in at this point in the story where I was like, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know I just did a short film. That was a lot of fun. That's for my church. And I was just as happy doing that as anything I've ever done. So I was giving this advice like, look, it doesn't matter what the success or failure is. Right now, I don't even know what my future is. I just know that I have more joy now than I ever have because it's not my job to feed the 5,000. It's only to provide the loaves and fish, yada, yada, yada. I mean, I was giving this speech with a lot of passion, even though at the moment I didn't have anything better. I was in fact a step down. And I remember the first time I gave this story, I mean, when I finished and I was giving that advice of like, look, I don't have anything to tell you about filmmaking. I don't have anything to tell you about success. I just know this. And I was sharing my story. There was like a standing ovation. I mean, people were crying. People were coming up to me saying that changed my life. Like I was in this space pre-chosen where I was genuinely joyful because I was surrendered to just doing whatever I was supposed to be doing in that moment that God had called me to do, regardless of the size or the success rate. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. I hope it does because it was a really long answer, but.
I love that because a lot of us would be tempted to say, in your situation, okay, I'm going to surrender, but only to this level. I'm going to surrender to maybe God doesn't want me to make this movie. I'm going to go make another movie. But you were really open. You were saying, I will do whatever you want me to do, no matter what it is. I will leave filmmaking. I'll go do anything that you want me to do. Just help me to know what it is. And that level of surrender is entirely different than, hey, I'll surrender and go do something else I want to do that maybe you want me to do.
Yeah. And I think that's where, my faith comes in. That might be different from some people who aren't believers and who don't define their life by their faith or by their relationship with God. But I do think it still applies, this notion of, you have people who aren't believers who have stories similar, who I gave up everything and I went and traveled the world, or I realized that this wasn't the thing I was supposed to do. So I went and did something different and I make, a tenth of the money I used to make and I feel better than ever. So I don't think this is a drastically unique concept. I think it is a concept that is birthed by the creator of the world. But you don't have to be a believer to understand the concept of whatever that thing is that I'm so passionate about might not be the thing that provides for my family. I think some people end up doing things that they love just as hobbies because they didn't work financially. So that's the big thing is and there's no magic pill in terms of knowing what God's will is. It's not like it writes it on the wall and you all of a sudden it just appears, you breathe on your mirror and the words start forming of what you're supposed to do next. So all I know is that I just focused on the day-to-day opportunities that I had and then making sure that I was maximizing that to the best extent. And that's the short film that I made ended up changing lives all over the world. And that I don't know if you want to know that part of the story, but that short film ended up going viral and it's ultimately what led to The Chosen. So, but I was telling this story and this podcast that we're doing right now, it would have sounded the same, 3 years ago. as it does right now.
Right when you were at the low point, right? Or the low point, the point of after the failure, the surrendering, what's next.
That first step after the low point where I was like, okay, that wasn't a low point. That was an opportunity for me to change my life.
I will say, that short film that you are talking about, I watched it somehow. I think I had seen it when it came out and when it had its kind of Facebook viral, went all over the place a couple years ago. But this year we watched it multiple times at Christmas and showed it to during, and that feeling you had when you watched Jack Nicholson in that scene where you said, I want to be able to get that emotion out. You have mastered that. Like, so as a fan and as somebody who, like, the stories that you've told that are so near and dear to so many people's hearts, and the perspectives that you've been able to tell them from, that hit me. So yeah, as you were talking about it just now, I started to get a little bit emotional just thinking about it. So job well done. You've reached your 16-year-old goal.
That's really profound. I've never had anyone point that out, and I've never thought of that. So that's really beautiful. I've never made that full circle connection, which is people have described for me what they felt when they watched that short film. And that's the next phase of the story, which is that the short film got in the hands of the streaming service who was looking for content. They heard my idea for a multi-season show. They were forever changed. When they saw the short film, one of the co-partners of the company said, my heart sang. Like I just felt so much joy at that key moment in the short film when the climax happens. And he said he just had tears streaming down his face. And he said, we have to be part of this. And they heard my idea for the show and they went crazy and they said, all right, that's great. And they said, we want to do this. And I got really excited. And they said, well, we want to raise the money through crowdfunding. And I got really depressed because I thought crowdfunding never works. It's always for tiny little projects. You see it on Facebook, someone saying, I'm raising money for X. And you see the progress bar and it never goes past like the halfway point. There's always like, $100 has been raised out of their $1,500 goal.
Yeah.
And the all-time crowdfunding record was $5.7 million. And from a project in Mystery Science Theater 3000, which had huge fan base already, I had no fan base. So I'm like, how in the world are we going to raise anywhere near that kind of money? Because that's what a season of a show like this would probably need. And they said, no, we're going to put this short film out on Facebook and YouTube. And at the end of it, you just say, look, if you want to see this idea that I have for a multi-season show, you can invest. And it was an investment opportunity, not a donation. It wasn't like a GoFundMe thing. So, I left my job for multiple reasons, but I left my job to launch this thing. For 6 months, I had no income. And God provided in unbelievable ways, just randomly, just enough at the right times. It was really crazy. But 6 months, I didn't have a job because it took so long to get SEC approval for what we were doing and for the fundraising opportunity. But this short film went out on Facebook and just went viral. And the response that people had was like what you said. Emotionally, people were saying, and they still tell me that to this day, they were like, I don't know what it was, but my gut and my heart were like singing. They were just, I couldn't describe, I was just started weeping and I don't know why. And I never cried. I mean, they had this emotional response. And the proof was in the pudding is we ended up, a few months later, generating $10 million, shattering the all-time crowdfunding record. And it was all based on the short film I did on my church's Christmas Eve service on my friend's farm in Illinois. And they hadn't even seen the full-length show yet. I mean, the $10 million came in from 19,000 people around the world just based on the short film. And I remember when we were sitting at the computer watching that number hit 10 million. And my wife turned to me and tears were streaming down her face. It gets me emotional remembering it, but she said, I do impossible math. And God was laying it on her heart just as clearly in that moment as he had the first time that he shared that with her, that this is what he meant by that. It was a year later. We finally understood, what that meant, because that was impossible math. $10 million, 19,000 people based on a tiny little short film I did for my friend or on my friend's farm. But when I've met investors who've come to me, anyone from the woman who invested $252, because that was all she had left at the end of the month, which means as much to me or more as the guy who invested $300,000 because he's extremely wealthy and that money probably didn't even mean much to him. But when they tell me why they did that, why they took the time to fill out a form and take 5 steps to invest in this Jesus show because they saw a short film, they've said, I couldn't not get involved. I was so emotionally gutturally punched that I had to do it. And it's never really hit me like what you just said, where that's what happened to me with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jack Nicholson and the director Milos Forman. That ultimately, that moment where I was like, I want to do that. That moment did actually happen.
That it happened a lot, obviously, to 19,000 people in that first round. All of the, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure you know all the numbers for getting through the first season and then into the second season with the pay it forward. I mean, so if you haven't gathered it yet and you're listening to the show and you're wondering what's going on, you will have heard it in the intro, I guess. But The Chosen, I mean, again, and I hadn't thought about this before because I hadn't heard the story about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but the short that you're talking about, that moment, that you're talking about, I know exactly when you're talking about. And then in the episode 1 of season 1 of The Chosen, I remember watching it and think, now I'm just going to start being a fan. So I'm going to try to be respectful of time and ask a couple more questions. But I remember thinking, this is super cool. Like, man, who is this? Is that Mary? I can't really tell, kind of like trying to figure out as it goes and as it builds, you're like, whoa, there's just a lot going on. And then the way that first episode, that climactic moment, I love that you can still get excited about it, thinking about it, but like that climactic moment when Christ comes in and you say, oh, I think that's Jesus. And then that moment when him and Mary embrace, oh my goodness, me and my wife are sitting there watching the show thinking like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, right. And both of us, I'm weeping and I'm saying this so that you understand that when Dallas is saying this, there's no exaggeration when people are telling him that they're having these experiences. I'm weeping and I look over, my wife's like, like trying to hold it in. And we're both just like, holy cow, that was so powerful. And I'm like, I got to get my kids in here. Come watch this. I want you to experience what can be done through this creative medium. One, just that's my mind as an entrepreneur and marketer. But then also as a Christian, somebody that says, look at this incredible story. This is real. This happened, and I believe that this happened. And I want to tell other people that this happened. And again, like you said, the proof is in the pudding as it's done what it's done. And again,
oh, that's great. I mean, I love hearing those stories and we hear them a lot, and I knew that needed to happen at the end of episode 1 because we were doing something really different. The show is not your typical Jesus project. In fact, a lot of believers had a harder time kind of comprehending episode 1 up until the end than even non-believers because a lot of Christians were watching it going, well, which Bible story is this? And which character is this? And I don't get it. Why I don't recognize this from scripture. And they weren't watching it like they do a normal show. Like when you first watch any great show, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, Walking Dead, you're not sitting there like spending the whole time. Who's that? Why
you're looking at it for the first time, letting the story come to you versus I've read this my whole life and I'm comparing it.
You're just kind of going, yeah. You don't expect to understand everything immediately and know everyone intimately right away. And you just let it come. And then you know that you're going to figure it out. So non-believers who've watched The Chosen have in many ways appreciated it quicker than believers because they were just like, I was just watching it like a normal show. But I still knew that if we didn't deliver, because I knew the first episode was going to be slow for some people. I knew it was going to be very plot heavy. And I'm like, if we don't deliver something big at the end of the episode, we might not have people watching episode 2.
Mission accomplished.
And so, but one of the reasons why that moment was so impactful is because of the setup, because we took the time. And that's the same is true with the Christmas short film. When you have the opportunity to take the time to develop the backstory and develop the emotional connections and develop the cultural context, the historical context, and the human context of these moments, then they become significantly more impactful. But yeah, that moment at the end of episode 1, I think is the keystone moment for the whole show, because if that hadn't have worked, then we wouldn't have people watching the whole season.
On set, when you're shooting that scene, what is the vibe on set? I mean, is it because we're talking action and you're working, everybody's at their job right now, but what is the vibe in these moments that people are feeling on the other side when they're sitting on the couch watching it on TV? What is that experience like?
Yeah, there's some moments when this is a big moment. Most of the time it's so functional. You have 12 hours a day. Everyone's just working their butts off. It's very exhausting work. It's very soul crushing work because it's just so technical and demanding. And the actors are the ones though who have to kind of maintain this key emotional state that, you know, whether it's positive or negative or whatever it is, they have to kind of stay in the zone. So you're trying to protect that. And, but for the most part, you know, it's pretty functional. That moment in particular, the end of episode 1, when we got to that moment and the crew was setting up the shots, Jonathan, who plays Jesus, and Liz, who plays Mary Magdalene, and we kind of knew we knew what this was. Mm-hmm. This was the moment that when they read the scripts, they blubbered into tears. This was a moment that when we talked about it, we knew this was the most important moment in the show. And all three of us were kind of separate from each other. But when I would look over at one of them, they were already crying. I was crying. It was like, I walked up to Liz and she was crying. And I just walked up and I said, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad to be doing this with you. Walked up to Jonathan. We hugged. We'd worked together before on these other Jesus projects, the short films. So we knew it was an important moment. Mm-hmm. And we desperately wanted to get it right. But we also knew that we couldn't worry about that the whole time. We couldn't put that pressure on ourselves. We just have to be in the moment and let it come and just do what the writing told us to do. And so that was one of those scenes where the vibe on set was, I usually make an announcement to the crew before a big scene like that or an emotional scene. Let's just keep it quiet. Let's not, in between takes, let's not do our usual chatter. You know, let's just try to protect the actors in this moment because they have to kind of stay in this emotional headspace. So you never know when you're shooting and if it's going to work because you're shooting it in different angles. So it's not like you're seeing everything happening all at once. So that's the bummer part of it because you finish and you're like, well, did we get it? Is this going to work? And you just don't know. And that was a scene that we took a lot of time on because the music had to be great too. The music in that scene is amazing.
Unbelievable.
And we took a lot of time on the music to make sure that it lived up to the moment. And in fact, even after when we first did a test screening of that scene, and I know for those of you who listening who don't care about movies, this might not be as exciting to you, but I think this does apply to all products, all initiatives, which is sometimes you test them. And we did a test screening and I remember watching it and going, oh, this moment is a little rushed. I need to find another 20 seconds to fill because we can't take people through this whole episode of pain. And I mean, this character is suicidal and there's just no joy throughout most of this episode. There's demon possession, there's pain, there's arguments, all this stuff. We can't rush the ending here. So we found another 20 seconds, just kind of milk the moment a little bit more and extend the music a little bit. And I mean, it was a slog to get to where it ended up being, but it was obviously worth it.
Yeah.
And
so
people describe that moment as like when we do on social media sometimes, like rank your favorite episodes or talk about, you know, your favorite moment. And that moment is talked about more than any by far. People just say, I was overcome. I felt like the show was, you know, Jesus was talking to me. And there's something transcendent about the show. And Truly. I say that with all humility because it's better than I am. The show is way better than I'm capable of. I experience that all the time. I'm like, man, how did I get here? Like, what is happening right now? Like, I've worked really, really hard to get better as a filmmaker, but this is way better than I am.
That's part of what makes the story so fascinating to follow along with as well. And is you bring that up a lot. You bring up, I mean, in you know, if you go follow it on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, I saw it on there, you know, when I was doing the research and stuff, like anywhere you go, you're telling these stories of this was the day-to-day and this is what, there's no way this should have happened. He shouldn't have arrived on time. The weather shouldn't have done this, you know, and you have these, I love how you're able to sit back and again, it goes back to this lesson that you learned that your job is to go find the loaves and the fishes and then to trust the process. And it's so visible in the work that you're doing. It's so tangible to say, and again, I love that you're sharing that story going back to the experience that you had and that life-changing moment because it's important. You know, it's not a side of things that you see just on the production of movies or TV shows. You don't see that. So it's cool in that aspect. But then again, when you bring in the extra element of, you know, faith and the process there as well, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's part of what has made the show what it is, both from a content standpoint and a success standpoint, is the audience is seeing, you know, I don't love to talk about myself per se, but that's kind of what's happening is they're seeing my story play out as well. And they're interested in that story. Part of it's just because they want to trust the person who's making the story about the man that they worship.
Yeah.
So when you're making a story about Jesus, you got to be really careful. And I think they need to trust who's behind it, because they don't want to invest in this either financially or emotionally if they feel like it's going to be Hollywooded up and changed or diminished. So that's part of it. But then I think from a content perspective, what's happening in our lives is also impacting what's happening on screen, and what's happening in our, my wife is the primary creator of our Bible studies and our devotional books, and even a children's book that she wrote based on episode 3, all of which are having tremendous success, because I think we're really stressing authenticity. Like, we are bearing our souls on screen and on the page and on social media. And I think I think people really want that right now. I think that there's so much in the world going on that isn't authentic. People taking offense to things that aren't even theirs. People forming tribes and responding to anything that's said from another tribe as automatically evil. And it's just so toxic and so, and also rooted in this, like, I think people can't really decipher where they land. Like,
yeah,
I don't want to be in that tribe because they say that thing that I disagree with, but I can't be in this tribe because they say this thing that I disagree with. And I can't be in that religion because they call this other religion heretical, and everyone just forming tribes, and people are like, well, what if I don't belong to any one particular tribe? And I think this show has been a very unifying thing for so many people, because we don't care about religion. We don't care about the walls that divide, as cliche as that sounds. We're just focused on the stories of Jesus.
Well, it's not cliche. And this is one of the things that Josh and I talked about. One of the points that I wanted to bring up that's been so eye-opening about this journey that you've been on is the one thing that everybody can relate on. Well, those that are believers, I guess, or those that are Christian, is Christ. And obviously, that kind of at its core, like, oh yeah, I'm Christian. I believe in Christ. I believe this guy lived, thousands of years ago, and he had these people that followed him, and he did these miracles. But when you really but like you're saying, there's so many divisive lines between religions and between how he lived and who he was, and there's so much divisiveness that, but this, as I've watched your audience grow, and as I've been a viewer and I've been a follower on social media and whatever else, it doesn't matter if you're Baptist or evangelical or LDS or Catholic or whatever, what Muslim, Jewish, like, you've just seen so many of these different faiths forget all of that and say, this is a fascinating story about an individual that we can all agree on. And there's creative liberty here or there, and there's different, but it seems that it's really torn down so many of those walls. And again, when you take that into a literal context, it's awesome. But when you take more of the spiritual or figurative side of that as well, and say, well, what is the thing that's bringing it? What is the show about? It's Christ. And that's the thing that's allowing everybody to seemingly forget a lot of those walls and
and I think I think one of the main reasons for that is, yes, the show is focused on Christ in the sense like The West Wing was focused on the president, but Martin Sheen's character, Jed Bartlett, wasn't the main character. He wasn't. True. He had the same amount of screen time as everybody else. And that's true of this show as well. And I think people are like, I'm interested to watch this first century show because it's the same reason I'm interested personally in watching Game of Thrones. I'm not a believer in the fantasy world of Game of Thrones, but I like watching a different culture, a different time period, and it's human. And I think people are identifying with the people around Jesus. Like, I can identify with this Pharisee, or I can identify with this fisherman who's struggling with debt and with keeping his family going. And so then I think that takes the sting off it a little bit as well. Because a lot of times when you watch Jesus movies, you're like, A, I can't really relate to Jesus as the main character because I'm not perfect. And B, he just goes from miracle to miracle, Bible verse to Bible verse. We never get to know anyone else. And there's nothing to really connect with here. It's just a kind of a reenactment of Bible stories that I've read before, but there's not really an emotional connection here like I normally have when I watch my shows. Yeah. And I'm hoping that that's the difference with The Chosen.
I'm curious, Dallas, how many times you've heard the same story that I'm about to tell you, which was my experience watching this for the first time. I didn't really know what I was getting into. I had heard about The Chosen, but I heard about it through the Harmon Brothers and VidAngel because I was already a subscriber and knew about them. And so I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what your background was. And so I started watching The Chosen and I'm like, well, I knew that some people who were members of the Church of Latter-day Saints were involved in this because that's my faith. And I just started assuming, oh, Dallas must be a member of my church because everything I'm watching in here jives exactly with what I believe about Christ in terms of personality and doctrine in the Bible. And I don't know how far I was into The Chosen when I realized, in fact, I think it was only because I went and I started watching some of the behind the scenes videos, and I watched your video somewhere talking to one of these churches with a pastor. And I realized Dallas isn't a member of my church. Like, how can this be? And then I found out that the character playing Jesus is Catholic. And I'm like, wait a second. Like, this is starting to sound like a joke, you know, like an evangelical, a Mormon, and a Catholic walk into a bar. It's like, it was this beautiful moment though, because I realized, well, wait a second. If Dallas is making this movie that aligns so well with what I believe, and he's got a Catholic guy acting as Jesus, it must align with what he believes about Jesus, or he wouldn't be doing it. How many other people are having this experience and thinking Dallas must be part of my tribe, The Chosen is part of my tribe, and then they find out it isn't? But then that's this uniting moment where you realize, maybe other people out there, maybe we're not so different.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you're bringing up the things that always get me in trouble. But yeah, it's funny because a lot of times people have the experience of assuming I'm part of their tribe. Then they find out I'm not. And then they're horrified and they, stop watching the show or pretend that they're going to stop watching the show, but then end up watching the show anyway. Yeah, it's really interesting. I have learned more about other denominations and faiths in the last few years than ever before because I did have the same experience when there's a guy who runs a Catholic church in LA who hosted a screening of The Chosen and was saying to the congregation, and when he had me in, he's like, oh, wow, this guy must be Catholic because it's such a good show. It's so accurate to Jesus. And then he finds out I'm an evangelical and he's like, how can this be? Exactly what you said. And I'm like, well, you might be surprised, And then when evangelicals watch it and they find out that I'm working with a lot of people who are LDS or Catholics, they say, how can this be? But not in a surprise friendly way, but in a, how could he do something so horrible by working with people who aren't evangelicals? We must be concerned about this show. And then they go, oh, well, maybe that's okay. Maybe I shouldn't. I mean, a lot of those things have happened. People not changing their minds about their denominations or their faith traditions, but maybe realizing that look, there's lots of people who work on the show who aren't even believers at all. I mean, probably over half of our cast and crew aren't believers in any faith tribe. And they love the show and they love working on the show. And people are kind of realizing like, wow, that maybe this doesn't have to look like everything that I expect that a Jesus show has to look like in terms of who's involved. But also, like you just said, which I think is true and which is happening much to people's chagrin, maybe there's more that we agree on than we thought. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm not going to go all the way to believing that, I'm not going to switch tribes here, heaven forbid. But I think when it comes to the stories of Jesus, at least, there's extraordinary unanimity. Most of the doctrinal and theological divides that have happened, even the significant ones, even the ones that cause people to think the other side is heretical, took place after Jesus was here. They're based on things that took place after Jesus was here. So I do believe that when you're just focused on the stories of Jesus, which is my job is to focus on the stories of Jesus. And if you, not you specifically, but the proverbial you, want to argue about the theology that took place afterwards and the interpretations of what Jesus's life meant, that's fine. That's your business. That's not going to be what we're about. I'm a strong evangelical. I'm an evangelical for a reason. I'm not LDS for a lot of reasons. I'm not Catholic for a lot of reasons. The show comes from an evangelical perspective. But that's a bit of a trick because when you watch the show, you can't tell what perspective it comes from because it's just focused on Jesus. And there's not really, the show isn't coming from one particular church, or one particular denomination. It's just focused on the stories of Jesus. And when you focus on that, it's amazing how the walls tend to fall down.
Yeah. And that was my point before. And that was the realization I had is what is the center point here? What is the objective? And it's Christ. And then all of a sudden, all those other walls kind of tend to come down and it's just, I mean, again, it's been a beautiful thing to.
As funny as I've never thought this would ever happen in my life, of course, but I'm more of a celebrity when I'm in LDS parts of the country than anywhere else. It's like per capita, the LDS community has been by far not by far, but has been huge fans of the show. And when I go into like a restaurant in Utah, that's where I'm going to get the most.
Never before has a Baptist walked into a restaurant in Provo and been cheered for. Hey, yeah,
exactly. Like, the conquering hero. It's been cool to meet so many wonderful LDS folks and to have. I mean, like as you know, probably a lot of the people involved in the project are LDS and have done more to advance this show to the world than anyone else. So anytime any evangelicals are concerned about that, I just laugh and I like, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. We're working with anyone who will advance this story to the ends of the earth. And, we have plenty of things we disagree about, but we don't disagree about this show. We don't disagree about Jesus of Nazareth. And so sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
That's how it's going to be. And it's been beautiful to watch.
I agree. So give us what's on the horizon right now. So I watched episode 2 last night with my wife. Loved it. The way that you continue to bring new characters in.
Is that the only episode you watched last night?
I watched episode 1 last week. And then I watched episode 2 last night.
You didn't stick around because we dropped episode 3 immediately afterwards.
Wait, you did?
What?
What? I didn't stick around. I literally watched it on the app casting to my TV and wrapped up at the end.
You didn't watch the live stream?
No.
Okay. So
now I can go on YouTube and the live stream is still.
Well, it's also on the app. The live stream's in the app as well. But yeah, we launch each episode with a big global live stream. So hundreds of thousands of people watching it all at the same time.
Yeah. And, I watched those. I watched those last season. I didn't watch the live stream. I watched it at like 11 p.m. last night.
You must have been watching the number though on the live stream going down. You're like, oh, there's going to be a lot of disappointed people tomorrow when they find out they missed it.
Yeah, the numbers stay strong through the episode, but then when the episode ends, there's usually people who drop off. And I had said before the episode, stick around because there's going to be a little surprise for you. And we lost. I was probably like 5%, maybe 10%. And then I said, all right, here's a sneak peek of episode 3. So we played this little 45-second sneak peek, and people were excited. And that looks great. And I said, you know what? I told you, and this is part of my answer to your question about what's on the horizon. I said at the beginning of season 2, we're not following a set schedule. Like every Friday, a new episode is going to come out because we just finished filming a couple weeks ago. We're just going to release episodes the moment they're done. Like as soon as we're done with them, we'll give you a heads up. We'll give you a few days. We'll give our tech team a few days to get them ready to post. But we're going to release them when they're ready. So episode 3 got ready like a day after episode 2 was. So we just decided on last night. So the day that we're recording this is Wednesday, and so at the end of the episode, I said, you know what? We showed that teaser, and then I said, you know what? I told you that we would the episodes when they're ready. So how about we just go right into episode 3 right now? And the chat went. I mean, we almost broke the internet. I mean, it blew up. There were literally on YouTube 1,800 comments in 60 seconds. My partner Daryl,
a lot of that. What are you kidding?
Oh yeah, just freaking out. Oh my gosh, because I'm guessing we've got to be the first show in history that ever just dropped an episode after another episode without telling people in advance.
Yeah,
isn't it great that you're not constrained by studios or Netflix or any? Like you can just do this stuff.
We do whatever we want. And I remember when I first had the idea, Angel initially was like, "Well, we want to kind of spread this out a little bit to try to build momentum, after each episode, let it marinate." And then the more we talked about it, one of the people on the staff said, let's think about the audience. What would they like? What would they want? And I said, look, if I was watching my favorite show and the episode ended and they just said, you know what, we're just going to.
And then the director comes on and says, let's just do one more.
I would freak out. And they were like, everyone was all like, yep, we would freak out. Let's make people freak out. So that's why I asked you, is that the only episode you watched last night?
Well, there's like a very small part of me that's like, oh man, I'm sad that I missed that experience. But then there's a huge part of me. It's like, hey, it's the next day. I'm talking to the creator himself and now I can go home tonight and watch episode 3.
Well, and there are people like my brother even said, he goes, this is why I don't like binge watching, because he watched both episodes last night with so many other people. And he's like, and when he was done with episode 3, which was his favorite episode of the whole show. In fact, a lot of people have said that.
Oof, I can't wait.
Episode 3, what you'll watch tonight, is unique and special for a lot of reasons. But he said, now I kind of forgot episode 2 because I watched them back to back. And I'm like, yeah, that is one of the negatives of binge watching is you forget kind of how each individual episode stands apart and it all starts to come together, which for some people they like, but yeah, you'll, I don't know what your preference is, but I do know I think you'll have a good experience. So
yeah, whether you like it or not, I'll send you an email and let you know as soon as I watch it.
This brings such a unique element to filmmaking because, I mean, nobody's really done this before, right? I mean, certainly not on this scale. And when you look at this and you look at the excitement that you can create in the audience because you're able to do things live and you're able to surprise people live, I just think, like, what does this mean for the future of cinematography? Because there's got to be people watching this and saying, I'm not going to go create the next Christian season or something, but how can I incorporate this into what I want to do with my show, with the content that I want to get out there? This feels kind of revolutionary. Like, this is, I mean, just not just that we're doing a crowdfunded show, but this type of interaction that you've brought to the table here is something that really we've never seen before. And how is this going to change not just this, but the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it'll depend on whether people see it as an opportunity to learn or whether they just go, well, that's an outlier. I don't concern myself with what other people do. So I've had a few people ask me, so how do you feel about the fact that you're changing the industry or changing the way things are done, doing something different? And I don't know. I mean, I think it's cool, but I don't want this to sound self-absorbed, but I really have gotten the superpower where I genuinely don't care what happens outside of what we're doing. I mean, as a believer, a Christian, I care about other people, but I'm just saying, like, I don't know, we're just doing what we feel led to do. And whether or not this results in a new paradigm, that's for others to worry about. For me, and I don't mean to just be dismissing your question. I'm just saying I just try to not think about those things, because in some ways you start doing things just to be different. Like, you just do them just because you want to be disruptive. And sometimes that's cool. And other times it's unnecessary. So I just try to focus on what would I want as an audience member, or what do I believe is something that could be really cool for people. And I remember when we decided a couple months ago to not release it on a schedule, we said, what if we just did this really cool thing where, and here's where this applies to any business. So this is not just the film business or the TV business, but when you start to do things that are different, that aren't playing by the rules, something really cool we realized would happen, which is word of mouth, like forced word of mouth, meaning when The Mandalorian comes out once a week, every Friday, you don't call your friend up on Thursday night and say, hey, don't forget The Mandalorian's coming out tomorrow night. You know that your friend already knows that. So you don't talk about it until the episode comes out. So word of mouth happens because people love the show, but there's not a lot of this like, oh my gosh, I just found out Mandalorian drops tomorrow night, because they already know. Well, with The Chosen, when we decided to just release episodes when they were finished, regardless of how the schedule worked, we were creating this inherent, by definition, demand for word of mouth. Because the moment we announce The Chosen episode 2 is coming Tuesday night, people are calling up their friends going, hey, I just found out it's coming out Tuesday night. Are you going to be there? Are you going to watch? And the word of mouth then by definition just expands on social media and conversationally. And it just adds this extra layer that you don't get when you just stick to a schedule. So I don't know if that applies to everything. I don't know if that's a good idea long-term, but we think it's kind of cool, and it's unique, and people, it seems to have these unintended consequences that I think serve us well. And just now you didn't even know episode 3 came out. And now you're going to call your wife or whatever and say,
literally my immediate thought was, I can't wait to text Bridget as soon as this is over, and I'm going to let her know.
Exactly.
Yeah. And tell other people. So I mean, you think of, you mentioned Breaking Bad or something earlier, like if it was, though that's typically like you wait to see the star of the show or whatever on a late night TV show, and then you wait for Comic-Con to be able to go and to actually hear them talk about it and participate. And then, let's go to Comic-Con because they're going to release the sneak peek thing, or, whatever, like these different conferences. And what you guys are doing is saying, we have the internet, we've got a built-in audience, let's be creative with this, and let's do all of the same elements, the same principles apply to the marketing and to the building and the branding and everything else, but you're leveraging and you're disrupting an industry that's been doing it the exact same way for a really long time, minus streaming coming in the last 5-10 years. But
you just get to the point where you go, why who's to say the experts are correct? I mean, who's to say it is correct? And every great moment of progress in industry or in media has come from someone saying, well, why do we have to do it that way? Why not this way?
Yeah.
I mean, Netflix completely changed the entire industry, because they were like, well, why do you have to do it that way? Like, that's how monopolies get broken up. That's why, again, mentioning my libertarian beliefs, is people are always like, the government needs to stop this because it's a monopoly. And I'm like, the private industry always tends to come up with things to break up monopolies much better than government does, without denying what government does. Is they end up denying the consumer something that they actually really liked, just because they want to protect some potential competitor. But the potential competitor sometimes does it better anyway. So when, Uber came along to disrupt the taxi monopoly, it's not like, if anything, the government was protecting the taxi monopolies. And Uber came along and goes, why do we need to wait for someone to drive by and flag them down? Why do we need to call up some company that's going to have a fixed charge? Why not just, they just were like, why do we have to do it that way? And I think that's what's happening with The Chosen, even with the content. We're just like, why do we need to follow that rule? Like, who said that's a rule? And who said that's like, we're not beholden to anybody. As long as we're not breaking the law, why do, it's just really cool when you get to that point where you just don't care whether it follows the rules. And more importantly, you don't care how it's going to be perceived. You also get to a point where you can't get canceled. You get to a point where you want to listen to feedback. And if the majority of the customers are telling you this sucks, we don't like what you're doing, well, then of course you're not a jerk. You're not arrogant. You want to be listening. But the way we're doing it is much more audience connected anyway. I'm listening in real time. I'm not waiting for a focus group. Like, I can watch the live chat and hear how people are responding to certain things. And so it's just more immediate. It's more intimate. And I think for us, it's on brand.
Yeah. Josh's ears keep perking up every time you say libertarian. You guys have to catch up on that another time.
I'm resisting. I'm not taking the bait. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but
he's a big time libertarian as well. So
I don't know what it is. That's the biggest thing I connect with LDS folks. I've never met a higher percentage of libertarians in any community other than the LDS community. Why is this? Why are you guys so libertarian? And they're like,
there's a lot to dissect. There's a lot to go.
Part of it's like, because they're so entrepreneurial, but also because they've been outside the system.
When you're part of a religion where the government actually had an extermination order declaring it was legal to kill you, you start to get a little suspicious of government. So
and I'm in Illinois where that took place. So I get it.
Look at us. If Joseph Smith could see us now, look at us having a great conversation. No exterminating happening. So I've said this multiple times. Well, actually, I was going to say one thing. You've prefaced a lot of what you said by saying, look, I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to seem dismissive of this, that, or the other. I think what this conversation does, and what I've heard a lot, is hearing the full context of your story. Specifically, if we just go back to that story about the moment of despair, the loaves and fishes, I can do impossible math. That story in and of itself gives you, when people understand and have that context, it paints the picture of why you're doing things you're doing and why you're doing them, how you're doing them. And there's none of that arrogance or anything of like, look, I don't care because I'm doing it the way I want to do it. I'm not worried about the outside figures and the outside numbers and the outside approval, because I've had a personal experience that gives me the drive, momentum, energy each day to do this for a different reason. And I think no matter what your faith is, no matter what your job is, no matter what you're doing, if you can find that why, as they put it, if you can find that meaning, that fulfillment, that thing that really gets you going. And you mentioned multiple times, and I've talked about this a lot, but those moments when you feel like I'm in the right place at the right time, doing the thing I was destined to do, if you can feel that, then keep on that path, right? And if you can find that extra outside motivation, that's not money, that's not, whatever, it really can make a big difference. And so as a fan of an incredible, it's such a privilege to meet you. Like as a fan of somebody that's done an incredible thing, and Josh and I being fans of you, it's a privilege and an honor to talk to you and to pick your brain and to hear. I love the work that you're doing. My only hope is that we get all the way through, 8 seasons? And I need to know, is it 8? Is that what you're 7? So at this point, like, are we getting through 7 seasons? Is that happening? Are you?
Well, I don't predict the future anymore. I don't feed the 5,000. I just work on the loaves and fish. I'm just working on finishing season 2, writing season 3. But at this point,
it's looking good.
Yeah, it's looking good. It's we're not too worried about it. The way that, because the show is free. That's where the impossible math comes in as well. The moment we decided to make the show completely free, all 8 episodes of season 1 in every country in the world, our income quadrupled and then quintupled, and it's never stopped. Yeah, we're tracking pretty strong. So
good. Well, it's funny because I obviously say that kind of as a tongue in cheek a little bit, but I also told Josh before, like I've invested in a lot of shows that I've liked and enjoyed as somebody who enjoys, watching good television or movies, and then they end early and you're like, dang it, like that stinks. I wanted to see what happened. It's like, well, no, I know how this ends, and I need to see Dallas and his team and these actors. I need to see them create it, like, because I already know what happens, but I need to see it through this lens. The way that this story is being told is powerful and moving and incredible. And again, if you don't know the first thing about Christ, or you don't care to, the story itself is a great television. That's how I explained it to people when I was explaining it to them. Like, imagine just a really well done TV show that just so happens to be about this individual that means a lot to some people. But even if you're just watching it as a viewer, it's a great story, and the stories are told so well. And so
I don't care about the Queen of England, like in a normal life, but like my wife and I love the show The Queen.
Yep.
It's just an interesting story about an interesting historical figure. And, the same thing is true of a lot of the things. I don't believe in the magic of Harry Potter, but those are still great movies.
Yeah.
So the Gandhi, the movie about Gandhi or anything. I mean, I think that's how people should look at the show. And I think that's why it's having the success that it's having.
Yeah, if you haven't watched it, go watch the first episode of the first season. You'll know what moment we talked about, and you'll see that, and you'll feel that, and you'll understand that, and then you'll jump in. And each episode, one of the things I was going to say earlier too is I love, you've mentioned it, but the pace that you tell the story at, because I loved how it's episode 3 of the first season when you took a step back and said, we're actually just going to go into the wilderness here with Jesus and this camp and some kids, and I remember just thinking, like, that was so peaceful and awesome to watch, and like this perspective I never would have thought of. But if you were to just tell me, it would be like, oh, that sounds like it might be kind of boring. But then the way that you're doing it, it's like, wow, that is such a cool, insight that I never would have been able to work up in my imagination because I hadn't been there before, and all that I've learned. And
episode 3 of this season is the same kind of thing. The little tradition that we've got going so far is because I have 2 co-writers, so the 3 of us write everything together, except for episode 3 of each season. So I write that by myself, and it's the episodes that don't have any plot, because I'm not a plot guy. My co-writer Ryan is a plot genius. I'm just like, my strength is people talking. And so episode 3 of season 1, I wrote this episode because I just said there were some things about Jesus that I wanted to say and wanted to portray. And so we just did this kind of out of time, out of place episode that wasn't tracking the plot per se of how the season was going. And so if you like that, you'll especially like episode 3 tonight. It's still part of the plot, but it's again, just this, it's what we call a bottle episode, where it's all kind of in one location and not a lot of things happen physically, but it might sound boring on the surface, but last night people were, the chat.
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm genuinely,
I've never seen so many cry emojis and exclamation points and all that stuff. So you'll like it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Keep it up. If there's ever anything somehow that we can do to help, please let us know. We're big fans, and we love what you're doing, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Josh, you have anything else before we wrap it up? James didn't make it home, did he?
He did not, but real quick.
James is his son, and he's watched the first season twice. And
he's the biggest fan in our family. He's 11 years old. He's watched all of season 1 twice, and he keeps wanting to watch it again. But this is my daughter. I just wanted to tell you. So when I started watching The Chosen again, I didn't know really who made it or the background. And I've had so many experiences watching Christian films that ended up being cheesy, and you can kind of tell they're low budget. And I'm always like, why can't somebody make something that's as good as what Mel Gibson would make, or as good as what James Gunn would make if he would make a Christian movie or something? Like, how come we don't see that type of stuff? And so I started watching episode 1, and I'm like hesitant, because I'm like, can I trust this to like not be cheesy? And then, so I'm watching the first episode, and I'm like, this is really cool because we're watching this film about Mary Magdalene. this is my daughter. Her name is Magdalena. And we named her Magdalena because Mary Magdalene, we don't know a lot about who she was, but we know that she was close to Jesus. We know she was the first person who saw Jesus after he was resurrected. And when we heard this name Magdalena, we thought that's our name for our daughter because we want our daughter to be close to Jesus and somebody who is a special friend of Jesus. So I'm watching episode 1. And then when it got to that moment, like I was just bawling. I was just sobbing and everything. And I never cry during movies, do I?
Oh, he cries in every movie.
Okay, yeah. So to be fair, I cry during every movie. But I was like bawling during that scene because I was just like, oh, Mary Magdalene and Magdalena. And oh, this is so good. And it really was, it was at that quality level too, though. Like it was at that level where I was like, I can actually refer this to my friends and I won't be embarrassed. I won't have to give that disclaimer. Yeah, it's a little bit cheesy, but it's really good message. You know, it was like, no, this is just good. It's really good. And so that's just my thank you, Dallas, for making this.
I appreciate that. I want to tell you something that Mary Magdalene and my portrayal of her is the thing that was the most kind of show altering, perspective altering part of creating this show, because in the first episode was the first one we wrote. And when we sent it out to my partners, we got multiple notes back on the episode. They all liked it, but the most common notes we got were about Mary Magdalene and the couple things that they didn't like about it. And then another person who happens to be LDS, who is a partner in VidAngel, he felt God pressing on his heart to call us and to share what he ended up sharing, which was, he was like, God is just laying it on my heart to tell you, like, be really protective of Mary Magdalene. Like please get her right. And combined with these notes that I was getting, it was just clear, like I hadn't gotten her right in the first episode. And so right around that time, I went to Israel for the first time. And I went to Magdala, the town where Mary was born. And there's a synagogue, like an old synagogue that they've discovered like 15 years ago, that when they were doing like a dig to build this cafeteria or something, and they ended up unearthing the synagogue. And it's a synagogue in Magdala that it's clear that Jesus was there. And there was even inscribed in the floor like a picture of the loaves and fish, like the 5 loaves and 2 fish and all this stuff. And I was in Mary Magdalene's birthplace, and that's where God spoke to me more than ever before about the show. And I was by myself, and I felt God lay on my heart, this show will be the show. And this portrayal of my people, the people who followed Jesus, in the future, when people think of Simon and Mary and James and John, and this show is who they're going to think of. The show is who they're going to picture in their minds. Because there's never been that before. You've had pictures of Jesus, but never images of the disciples that actually stand out and register. And they're like, this show is going to be the thing that people think of when they picture these people. And I'm not going to let you screw it up. And it was especially about Mary. And I believe that there is a special, almost transcendent thing about Mary and about the show that God is protecting in that character more than almost any other character. And so I do hope you get a chance to go to Magdala someday, because what happened is a year later, my co-writers also took a trip to Israel by themselves with a guide without me. And the trip ended up being a bit of a disaster in many ways. They said the one thing that was great though about the trip, the one thing that made it all worthwhile, and they didn't know my story, is they said, we went to Magdala and there's this old synagogue that had been unearthed. And I'm like, yeah, I know, I was there. And they're like, and there was this Catholic priest who was there who kind of, manages the place. And he said, just go and sit down and just get away from each other and just sit down and be quiet. And just be in the synagogue, because synagogues were where Jesus preached and taught. And he says, just think about the fact that the creator of the universe wants to be with you. He wants to talk to you specifically. And these 2 guys, one of whom's not even an evangelical, is strong, like he's kind of new to the faith a little bit. He believes in God, but he's not like a strong, specific evangelical Christian. And they both had these profound, like 20 minutes of where they couldn't even talk. They were like just overwhelmed spiritually. And someone else told me, who's not a part of the show, told me that when they were in Israel, the most profound experience they had was at the synagogue of Magdala. So I tell you that for two reasons. One is it's not an accident that you had that experience watching episode 1. It's not an accident that people are so connected to this character, because God is protecting her. And Liz Tabish, who plays her, was a former Catholic who had kind of strayed from her faith and was in a low point. And when she read this, she'd even told her agent, don't submit me for any more roles. I'm done with this industry. And then her agent submitted her anyway and sent her the script. And she said, I was just bawling my eyes out. And she kind of returned to the faith in many ways because of this part. And, but I also want to tell you this because I really hope you get a chance to go to Magdala and go to that synagogue, because I think it'll have a big, sorry, I'm like your dad, Magdalena. I cry a lot, but it'll have a big impact on me.
Sounds like a plan. Should we do a trip there?
Awesome. Dallas.
Keep watching season 2, because Mary Magdalene has a big part of season 2 coming up. In a lot of ways, not always good, not always happy, but we really explore Mary Magdalene a lot in season 2. And she has a line in episode 3 that is a mic drop moment where she says it and all the disciples just kind of go, whoa. So she keep watching, because she'll continue to be one of your favorite characters, I promise.
Awesome. You've been so generous with your time. We appreciate you. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks, Dallas.
Thank you, Dallas.
Thank you. So nice to meet you, Magdalena.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy Podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy Podcast.